In the forgotten bends of a river no longer named, there is a village where sorrow is not spoken, not wept, not wailed, but collected. For generations, the people here believed that grief, if left to drift freely, could summon back the dead. So they poured their pain into clay. 7 nights of tears caught in handcrafted jars, sealed with ash, buried beneath the hearth to keep the spirits still. But what happens when those jars break? What happens when mourning is misplaced, or worse, never done at all? Welcome to FolkFear, where we do not tell ghost stories, we unearth them. And tonight, we open the Mourning Jar, a tale of grief gone wrong, of tears too late, and of spirits shaped not by death, but by the sorrow we tried to bury. Sit close, listen deeper, and whatever you do, don't break the jar. There is a village forgotten by time and mapmakers, a cluster of moss-laced roofs huddled beside a restless, brown river that curves like a coiled serpent through the earth. The wind here never sings. It murmurs, low and broken, as if it once knew a song but lost the words long ago. The villagers call it Hatan, though even that name is rarely spoken aloud. Outsiders, if they ever wandered this far, would say it smells of wet earth, fermented rice, and something else, something faint like memory turned to mildew. Here, people do not cry, not in public, not in private, not even for the dead. Instead, they follow a ritual older than any stone in the ground. When someone dies, the bereaved must weep directly into a clay jar, not a cup, not a cloth, but a jar crafted by hand, shaped under the moon, and fired with silence. 7 nights, 7 tears each night, no more, no less. The jar must then be sealed with ash, marked with a line of salt, and buried beneath the family's hearth, never touched again, never disturbed. It is said to hold the grief in place, to contain the sorrow, and keep the spirit from returning, lost and unfinished. No one questions this, not even Mai, the widow, whose husband had just died that morning. She sat stiffly in the center of their home, her hands folded on her lap like broken wings. Smoke from incense coiled into her hair, and her eyes were dry, not from strength, but from the pressure of knowing her time to grieve must be measured, regulated, confined. They had brought her the jar already. It was placed gently before her on a reed mat, small, round, mottled brown with age. The rim was chipped, but the inside was clean. Too clean. She stared at it like it might stare back. The old women who handled the village's mourning rites, 4 of them, dressed in black, stood silently in the corners of her home, offering no comfort, only presence. "Your first tears must fall before the sun dies, and none must fall elsewhere," one of them finally murmured. Mai nodded. Her lips were pale. Her hands trembled only when she touched the jar, drawing it closer to her knees. She had not loved her husband, but she had shared his bed for 19 years. She had fed him rice when he lost his teeth. She had wrapped his swollen legs in cloth soaked with bitter herbs. She had watched his skin turn yellow. She had listened to the wet rattle in his chest. She had waited for it to end. When he died, she felt nothing. Not joy, not sadness, just release. And now she had to pretend it was sorrow. So she closed her eyes and dug into the hollowest places of her memory. She thought of her mother, long gone. She thought of the miscarriage child. She thought of the dog that once waited by her door, even after it went blind. And from somewhere, deep, dark, and unrelated to the man now wrapped in linen in the next room, came the tears. They fell, slow and warm, into the jar. 1, 2, 3. The women watched in silence. 4, 5, 6. She paused. The 7th tear did not come. Not until she whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry." Then it fell, alone. That night the wind rose. It carried with it a strange smell, not rot, not rain, but something ancient. Clay dust, maybe, or salt water from a sea that once existed, long before the river swallowed it. Outside, the frogs went quiet. The trees held their breath, and beneath her hearth, something shifted. She didn't hear it, but the youngest of the mourning women did. Her eyes flicked to the fireplace, then back to Mai, uncertain. She said nothing, only tightened the knot on her sash and left before the shadows deepened. The next day, Mai continued the ritual. Another 7 tears. She tried to keep her thoughts on her husband, to summon guilt, to fabricate longing, but the tears refused. They came instead from other places, the ache in her back, the dreams she never chased, the loneliness she had never named. Still, she gave them to the jar. On the 3rd night, the jar grew warm to the touch. On the 4th, it hummed, faintly, like breath beneath soil. She said nothing. By the 6th night, something had changed in the village. The air was heavier, the ground seemed softer, as if the river was reaching its fingers inland. Chickens refused to roost. Dogs barked at empty corners. Children cried in their sleep, then woke speaking names they didn't know. One boy whispered, "He says the jar is too full." No one asked who he was. On the 7th night, Mai sat before the jar in silence. The final 7 tears. But this time, they came too easily. She thought of nothing. She only looked into the jar, and the tears fell, fast, eager, unnatural. And when the last one dropped, the clay pulsed. Mai flinched. The surface of the liquid inside the jar, if it could still be called liquid, rippled. A face flickered across it. Not her husband's, not hers, just something watching. The hearth behind her let out a dull, hollow knock, once, then silence. Mai sealed the jar. Her hands shook as she sprinkled ash and salt across the lid. She buried it beneath the hearth before midnight. When she stood again, the room felt colder, but not empty. She slept restlessly that night, curled into herself like a child. Her dreams were thick with shadows and voices that didn't move their mouths. Something whispered her name in the voice of her husband, but slower, wetter. She woke just before dawn. A smear of clay was on her pillow. The villagers did not ask how her mourning went. They never do. Grief is not a communal affair in Hatan. It is private, regulated, contained. But Mai knew something was wrong. She had followed the ritual. She had buried her sorrow. But the jar had been old, too old. And if the clay had already drunk another's tears, if it had once held a grief not her own, then the spirit sealed inside might not be her husband, might not be anyone. The river rose that week. Not by much, just a few inches, but enough to make the elders mutter and count dates on their knotted string calendars. One of them whispered, "It's too early." Another replied, "Maybe one of the jars cracked." The oldest elder, blind and bent with age, said nothing. He just turned his head slowly towards Mai's house and whispered, "We never should have used the old ones." Mai tendered her hearth with trembling hands. She kept the fire burning, not for warmth, but for silence, because beneath the flames, under the stones and ash and earth, something had begun to breathe. And every night now, as she lay in bed, she heard it whisper her name. But it wasn't her husband's voice. Not anymore. The seventh night had come and gone, but the air in Mai's home still trembled like something unfinished. She tried to pretend she hadn't noticed. The jar was sealed, the mourning was done, the ritual, precise, old, immutable, had been followed. She told herself that, over and over, like a lullaby made of rules. But the hearth whispered at dusk, and the shadows beneath it moved when they shouldn't. By morning, Mai stopped lighting the fire. She said it was because of the heat, because the monsoon season was coming early, because wood was harder to come by now. But the truth was simpler. She was afraid of what the fire might show. Sometimes, in the glow, the soot outlined handprints, not her own, pressing against the stones from the inside. Outside, the village began to shift in small, quiet ways. It started with dreams. Children woke in tears, whispering things no child should know. Burial sites, names of the long dead, secrets passed from mother to daughter that were never spoken aloud. One girl, no older than 6, sat up straight at midnight and said in a voice not her own, "You sealed me in before I had finished weeping." Her parents thought it was sleep-talking, until she began drawing mourning jars in the dirt in circles that grew larger each day. In the square, a group of fishermen gathered at dawn, their faces pale. They had come to speak of the river. "The water is thick." "Like blood?" asked another. "No," came the reply, voice low. "Like tears that waited too long." They all fell silent. Then one man, old Kien, whose wife had died the year before, whispered, "My jar cracked last winter. I didn't tell anyone." They looked at him in horror. "You should have," someone said. "I thought it didn't matter," Kien muttered, eyes sunken. "I buried it deeper." But now the river wept, and no one knew which sorrow it carried. Mai, meanwhile, could no longer sleep. Each night the whispers grew clearer, not just her name now, but sentences. "You mourned into what was already full. Your sorrow is not yours alone. There was no space for your tears." She tried to block it out, stuffed rags in her ears, burned more incense, prayed to ancestors she barely remembered. Nothing worked. The voice had moved beyond the hearth. It now lived beneath her skin. On the 8th night, the night after the mourning was supposed to end, she did something she wasn't supposed to do. She unsealed the jar. Not fully, just cracked the line of salt, brushed away the ash, and pressed her ear against the cool lid of clay. She told herself it was curiosity, but the truth was desperation. Inside, it was not silent. She heard water, thick, bubbling like something breathing through tears. She also heard weeping, not hers, not her husband's, but a deeper, older grief, one shaped like a woman's voice. And then, slowly, she felt it, a heartbeat. not in her chest, in the jar. The next day, she tried to ask the mourning women for guidance. She found 2 of them in the forest behind the temple, gathering herbs. She did not speak directly. She asked instead in metaphor, as is the way of grief in Ha tone. "What happens," she said slowly, "if a jar already held sorrow before it was used again?" The older woman stiffened. Her hands paused mid-motion, stilling the leaves. The younger one dropped her bundle. "No one reuses a mourning jar," the older woman said. Her voice was flat. "But what if someone did, not knowing?" There was silence. Then the older woman turned to her, eyes sharp, unreadable. "Then 2 griefs become one true, one lost, and neither can rest." That night, Mai dreamed of her husband, but not as he was. He stood at the foot of her bed, thin and dripping with river water, his mouth full of mud, his eyes missing, just dark sockets filled with swirling clay. He did not move, but when she opened her mouth to scream, she tasted salt and ashes, and he spoke without lips. "You borrowed grief that was not yours." In the days that followed, the village grew quiet, too quiet. The frogs stopped chirping. The birds did not return. The smoke from chimneys spiraled straight up, like it too was afraid to drift. People stayed indoors. Eyes darted to the hearths, to the ground, to the jars they had buried. Old grief began to rot, and the dead began to stir. One boy drowned in a puddle. It was only inches deep, but he had fallen into it during play, and when his mother found him, his mouth was filled with clay, not dirt, clay. Another girl was found speaking to her reflection in the river, reciting lullabies in a dialect no one had used in generations. The elders called a meeting, rare, unwelcome. "We must dig up the hearths," one suggested. "No," snapped the eldest, "to disturb grief is to set it loose." "Then it's already loose," someone said, "and it's wearing our faces." But no decision was made. Fear sat between them like a third presence, and beneath Mai's house, the jar began to hum again. On the 14th night, twice the mourning period, Mai tried to pray. She lit the incense, folded her hands, bowed 3 times to the west, but the words came out backwards, not in voice, but in meaning. She spoke forgiveness and tasted bitterness. She said peace and felt only dread. She turned to the hearth and saw footprints, small, bare, clay-stained, coming out from the stones and vanishing into the back room. She followed them barefoot. Each step left smears of ash across her floor. At the end of the trail stood her husband's old chair, and in it sat a woman, young, pale, hair damp like riverweed. Her hands rested on her lap, as still as a corpse. Mai froze. "I died weeping," the woman said, without turning. "But they sealed me too soon. Now I carry your sorrow too." Then she vanished, just disappeared, like breath on glass. Mai fell to her knees. She crawled back to the hearth and began to dig, tearing up stones, scouring ash, her fingers raw. The jar was there, but it was different now. The clay was darker, the lid bulged wet, the salt had turned black. She reached for it, and it pulsed again, not once, but twice, like 2 hearts beating inside. She screamed, not from fear, but from understanding. She had poured her tears into a vessel that already held unfinished sorrow, and now they were joined. Two griefs, one jar, no peace. The next day, the river swallowed the first house, not mine, but one near the edge. The water rose without warning, no rain, no storm, just a slow, warm rise, as if something beneath had begun to weep upward. The villagers fled that home. They left everything behind. But when they returned later, cautiously, together, they found the hearthstones cracked wide open. And beside it, on the floor, was an empty mourning jar, tipped sideways, a single clay handprint on the wall, and the words carved by fingernail into the floor. Sorrow doesn't die, it only waits.
The river did not roar when it rose. It crept, it slithered, it bloated like something long dead, now returning to the surface. By the third week after the mourning jar was sealed and unsealed, the villagers of Ha Ton stopped measuring the days by sunrise or bells. They measured time now by how high the water had climbed. The footpath to the temple was the first to vanish. Then the bamboo bridge that connected the far fields. Then, without warning, the shrine to the water goddess swallowed whole in one night. Some said it was a seasonal surge. Others, quieter and older, said it wasn't the river that had risen, but what was beneath it. Mai stood at her threshold and watched the water lick at her doorstep like a tongue. It hadn't reached her hearth, not yet, but she knew the flood wasn't here for her home. It was here for what was buried beneath it. She had tried to dig it up. She had tried to warn the mourning women, to plead with the elders, but none would touch a jar sealed with sorrow, especially one sealed twice. The head mourning woman had looked at her with pity and said, "A jar opened after mourning ends is not a vessel, it's a wound. And wounds, Mai knew, do not stay closed." The dreams returned, worse now, not images, but sensations. She would wake to the feeling of wet hair brushing her cheek, of hands pressing gently on her chest, of weeping so close it felt like it came from inside her mouth. Sometimes she would taste salt on her tongue before she even opened her eyes. Sometimes she woke crying, and she didn't know whose grief it was anymore. The village changed in strange, silent ways. Children walked in single file at night, barefoot toward the river's edge. The mourning jars beneath other homes began to crack, the seams hissing, lids swelling, as if the earth could no longer contain what had been buried. One woman found a bone in her fire pit, thin, curved like a rib, but her family had not lost anyone in years. She burned it. That night, her husband saw their dead daughter standing in the rice field, her mouth open, her face dripping with mud. He never spoke again. In the forest, near the temple ruins, the younger mourning woman, the one who had seen the hearth tremble on Mai's first night, found something buried in the roots of a fig tree. A jar, not marked, not sealed, open. Inside was water so still it reflected the sky, but the sky it showed was wrong. Cloudless, gray, full of flies. She smashed the jar with a rock and left it there. But something followed her home that night, something that knew her name. And still the river rose, not violently, not as punishment, as grief. Slow, heavy, inevitable. And as it rose, memories returned, not in the minds of the villagers, but in the air itself. Old songs that hadn't been sung in generations floated faintly on the wind. Doors creaked open on their own. Laughter echoed from empty wells. And in every home where a mourning jar had cracked, there came the smell, salt, clay, and something deeper, like forgotten breath. Mai began keeping a lamp lit at all hours. She watched the floor constantly now, waiting for the return of footprints. But it wasn't footprints that came. It was roots, tiny hair-like tendrils pushing up between the hearthstones, pale, twitching. She burned them. They came back. She poured boiling water. They spread wider. One night, she lifted a stone and saw not earth beneath, but a hollow space, wet and pulsing, as if the house itself was now built over a mouth. A traveler came through the village, unaware. He was young, dressed in modern clothes, and laughed when warned about the jars. He stayed the night in the home of an old widow who no longer spoke. In the morning, he was gone. All that remained was his camera and his shoes, still tied, sitting at the edge of the hearth. The memory card was blank, but the lens of the camera was fogged from the inside. By the 5th week, the flood took the first graveyard. The waters swept through the bamboo markers, unearthing bone, wreath, and clay alike. Dozens of ancient mourning jars, once buried with the first generations of villagers, were dragged loose by the river's teeth. And when they shattered against the rocks, the air changed. The sky darkened without clouds. The wind grew warm, and the river's song, which once was a gentle babble, turned into something slower, lower, almost a chant. People no longer dreamed of their own dead. They dreamed of strangers. Strangers with clay skin and hollow eyes, who asked, "Where are my tears? Where is my name?" That night, Mai went walking, not far, just to the edge of the village where the shrine once stood. There, in the shallows, were the shards, dozens of them, of broken jars. She crouched, running her hands through the silt. Every fragment was smooth, worn, as if the sorrow had been washed clean, except one. One shard was still wet. She picked it up and turned it over. On the inside, etched faintly by hand, were the words, "This was never for you." She dropped it. Something moved in the water. She didn't look. She walked backward until she reached dry earth again, and then she ran. Back home, she found the hearth cold, but not silent. From beneath the stones came a faint sound, barely audible. Breathing. Not hers, not human. Something rhythmic, deep, not fast, not slow. Grief-shaped. She fell to her knees and whispered through the cracks, "Who are you?" There was no answer. Only a second breath, joining the first. Two now. Two sorrows. Two hearts, twinned in clay. And beneath it all, the sound of water, rising. In the following days, the village grew thinner. Some fled, most simply faded. The old man who tended the bell tower was found asleep in the mud, hands folded, mouth filled with river pebbles. The mourning woman who had found the open jar walked into the woods and never came back. The children stopped speaking altogether, and in the center of it all, Mai's house stood still. The hearth cracked now, stone by stone, like ribs splitting open. The jar pulsed beneath it. The air inside her home no longer smelled of incense. It smelled of loss, left too long in the dark. And the river rose again. But this time, It brought something with it, something shaped like a person, but not, made of bone and mud and tears that had no owner. It stood at the edge of the square where the temple once stood, and wept without eyes. And from the cracks in the ground, the other mourners began to answer. The hearth cracked fully on the first night of the new moon. Not with a bang, not with fire, but with the gentle, sickening pop of something too swollen to hold its shape. Mai woke to the sound and didn't move. She lay frozen on her mat, staring into the dark, heart pounding in a rhythm that didn't feel like her own. The silence that followed was not empty, it was listening. She pulled her blanket up to her chin, as if cloth could stop whatever had just surfaced beneath her floor. But the breath came anyway, wet, close, inside the walls. By morning, a hairline fracture ran along the stones of her hearth, blackened with moisture. Salt crusted the edge of the gap, turning the floor brittle beneath her feet. She swept it away, and for a moment, just one, she thought she heard a voice sigh from underneath. She dropped the broom. It wasn't the voice of her husband. It was too high, too hollow, too recent. She didn't go outside that day. She didn't light incense, didn't boil water, didn't speak. She sat on the floor staring at the hearth, waiting. Something was shifting, not just in the house, but in her. There was a tightness in her chest, a heaviness behind her ribs like sorrow fermenting. And when she cried that night, not because she meant to, but because she couldn't stop it, the tears didn't fall from her eyes, they fell from her nose, her ears, her mouth, as if the grief had forgotten where it belonged. At dusk, she heard the whisper again, clear this time, feminine, crooked at the edges, like wind moving through broken pottery. You gave me your tears, but not your name. Mai froze. She didn't answer. She couldn't, because deep down she knew the voice was right. She had mourned into that jar not for the man she'd buried, but for herself, for all the things she'd never said, for all the love she never received, for all the quiet suffering she wrapped in silence. And now someone else, someone already dead, had drunk from that sorrow. The whisper came again. You used me. You filled me, but I was not empty. The air around the hearth grew colder, and then came the laughter, faint, childlike, but cracked, like a girl who had cried too long and broken something inside. Mai stood slowly. She moved toward the hearth with numb feet, each step echoing hollow across the wood. Kneeling, she placed her hand against the cracked stone. It pulsed beneath her palm. Not just warmth, a heartbeat. She whispered, "What do you want from me?" Silence. Then, "What you took. My end." She tried to recall the burial that night, the night she sealed the jar, the one the women had brought her, already fired, already shaped. She assumed it was new, just old in design. No one told her otherwise, but something about it had felt worn, polished, familiar. And now she understood. It had been used, not once, twice. Jars were never meant to hold more than one grief,
To do so was to confuse the sorrow, to fracture the spirit. Now, the thing beneath her hearth didn't know who it was mourning, and neither did she. She left the house for the first time in days. The village was quieter than ever. Most windows were shuttered, doors barred, smoke no longer rose from the chimneys. As she passed the old temple stones, a child watched her from behind a tree. His eyes were wet with mud, not tears. He didn't blink. He only whispered, "She's inside you now." She turned and ran, back home, back to the hearth that cracked every time she tried to look away. She grabbed a stick of chalk from her altar drawer and began to draw. She didn't know the symbols, not really, just shapes she half remembered from childhood prayers, protective glyphs, circles, crossed lines, salt spirals. When she finished, she knelt in the center and waited. The night came heavy, moonless. The wind brought the sound of jars clinking, hundreds of them, from beneath. Then the hearthstone lifted, only slightly, only enough for air to hiss through, and from the gap came a voice of two people layered, one old, one young, both broken. "I wept for my child, and you poured your grief into mine. Now we are one, now we are none." She screamed, but her voice made no sound. Instead, the clay beneath the hearth cracked fully, a jagged rupture from one wall to the other, and from that wound steam rose, thick and warm. It smelled like old tears and unspoken apologies. She crawled backward, away from the hearth. As she reached the door, she looked back once, and there, seated cross-legged on the floor where her altar used to be, was a woman. Not flesh, clay. Eyes hollow, mouth soft, weeping silently without tears. In her lap, a mourning jar, full, overflowing, bubbling. And beside her, Mai's reflection, lying across the floor like a shadow that didn't belong to her anymore. She fled, into the night, into the dark, into the river fog that had now crept into the alleys, and behind her the whisper followed, not loud, not angry, just grieved. "Finish mourning me, so I can leave." She wandered to the forest's edge. There, among the fig trees, stood a small shrine no one tended anymore. She lit incense with shaking fingers, and she whispered the only thing she could, "I'm sorry." But the voice in her chest replied, "That is not a name."
In the village of Ha Ton, the grief was no longer buried. It wandered, it whispered, it wore faces not its own. And every night, more people dreamed of voices that didn't belong to the dead they'd lost, but to those they had never known. The mourning jars were meant to be sacred, each one shaped by hand, dried under moonlight, etched with the name of the departed, and used only once, to catch the sorrow of a single mourner over 7 ritual nights. But in the years after the potter died, the last woman who knew how to make the jars properly, the villagers had begun reusing old ones, quietly, secretly. Grief was still grief, they reasoned. The clay wouldn't know the difference. But the clay remembered. And now it bled sorrow back into the world, corrupted and confused, sorrow that had nowhere else to go. Mai sat at the edge of the flooded grove, barefoot, watching the water creep through the trees. She hadn't returned home since the night the hearth cracked open. She no longer slept. She didn't dare. because every time she closed her eyes, she saw two women sitting across from each other, both holding the same jar, both weeping, both trying to fill the same space with grief that didn't fit. And in those dreams, neither of them had a face. She whispered her name aloud, again and again. "I'm Mai. My husband was Tuan. I mourned for him. I did what I was told." But the voice inside her replied with something colder. "Then why do you dream of someone else's child?" Mai didn't answer, because it was true. Lately, she had dreamed of a girl, maybe 8 years old, standing barefoot in the river, hair clinging to her cheeks, holding a tiny broken jar in her hands. The girl never spoke, but her eyes wept for two people at once. That morning, Mai returned to the old mourning hut at the edge of the forest, a building no one had entered in years. It was where the elders once kept unused jars before the floods had warped the door and vines had split the walls. Inside, everything smelled of mildew and clay. She rummaged through the shelves with trembling fingers. Dust filled her lungs, cobwebs caught in her hair. Then she found it. A jar, nearly identical to the one she'd been given, chipped in the same place, lined faintly with the same floral etching near the base. She hadn't received a new jar. She had been given a buried one. Suddenly she remembered, the night before her husband died, she had seen the mourning woman digging near the temple ruins. When Mai asked what she was doing, the woman had smiled tightly and said, "Preparing." But now she saw it differently. She hadn't been preparing a jar. She had been retrieving one. Mai carried the jar outside. She didn't cry. She felt nothing, because the grief inside her no longer knew where to go. It had leaked, merged, rotted, and turned into something else, something sour. She buried the jar again, not beneath her hearth this time, but beneath the fig tree near the shrine. And as she pressed the last handful of dirt down, she whispered, "Who are you?" The ground was quiet, but the wind behind her answered, a voice carried on leaves and dust. "She was not mourned, so she found your sorrow and wore it." That night, a woman named Lien, who had never spoken since her son's drowning, began laughing in her sleep. When her husband shook her awake, she opened her eyes and said, "I'm not Lien." Then she wept, clawed at her own face, and whispered a name that hadn't been heard in the village in 50 years, a name no one remembered except the earth. Children began drawing jars in the mud, but the jars were always cracked, always full, and always weeping. One girl dug a small hole beside her house and whispered into it, "You can use my name if you're still looking." The next morning, her footprints ended at the river. They found her shoes, her doll, and a perfect, freshly sealed jar beside them, warm to the touch. The mourning women tried to call a gathering. Only 6 people came. One of the elders stood and spoke with hands that trembled against his cane. "We should have burned the old jars. Instead, we buried them and hoped sorrow would sleep. But sorrow does not sleep. Sorrow remembers." They began cataloging the homes most likely to have used borrowed jars. And as the list grew, so did the understanding. Most in the village were not mourning their own dead anymore. They were finishing someone else's grief. Mai returned home on the final day of that week. The house smelled of ash and clay. The hearth had collapsed completely. Beneath the stones, the soil had turned dark, wet, spongy, as if water had replaced memory itself. She didn't speak. She swept the floor in silence, and when she reached the center of the room, she saw it. A single footprint in the dust, too small to be hers, but too large to be a child's. It wasn't walking toward the hearth, it was walking out. That night, she didn't sleep again. Instead, she sat where the fire used to be, facing the empty space where the jar had been buried. And without meaning to, she began to hum, a lullaby, faint, unfamiliar. She didn't know the words, but her lips moved anyway. In her dream, the girl returned. This time she spoke. "You gave me your tears, but not your pain." Mai knelt before her. "I didn't know." The girl tilted her head. "Then how did it feel like dying?" Mai reached out her hand. The girl didn't take it. Instead, she turned and walked into the fog. And as she faded, Mai saw that the girl's shadow was too long, far too long, as if it was carrying another person inside it. Mai woke up with clay on her fingertips and the taste of salt on her tongue, not from crying, but from something else weeping through her. That morning, the river rose again, and the villagers gathered at the center of the village, staring down at the swirling brown water, rising in spirals now, as if something was breathing beneath it. Not weather, not flood, not wrath, grief, nameless, inherited, refused. They turned to Mai, and for the first time since the ritual began, someone asked her, "Did you use the wrong jar?" Mai didn't speak. She only nodded. And in her silence, all of them saw their own reflection.
The dreams were no longer dreams. They were memories, but not yours. You would lie down with your own sorrow and wake with someone else's tears staining your pillow. A face you never knew, whispering a name you never spoke, standing at the edge of your mind like a stranger begging to be remembered. The dead had returned to Hatan, but not as they were, and not for vengeance. They came hollow-eyed, soft-voiced, and starved of completion. The first to see them was the blind elder. He had not spoken in months, his mouth twisted by age and silence. But one morning, the villagers found him sitting in the village square, eyes still closed, head tilted up as if he could see through the clouds. He spoke 5 words. "They don't blink, they weep." Then he collapsed, hands pressed to his face, and began to sob. The villagers tried to help him, but the tears wouldn't stop. They poured from his eyes, thick and brown, until it wasn't water anymore, but mud. He drowned in it, choking on the sorrow he had sealed away decades ago. The elders burned his body without ritual. They said it was safer that way. Mai stopped sleeping altogether. Not because she was afraid, because sleep had become occupied territory. Each time she drifted off, someone else opened her eyes. She would wake inside someone else's grief, her hands older or smaller, her voice changed. She once woke holding a dead baby in a bundle of cloth. Another time, she stood knee-deep in a river with ropes tied around her wrists and rocks in her pockets. In every dream, she wasn't herself, and in none of them was she alone. The clay was everywhere now, in the corners of windows, under fingernails, on doorknobs, even in the food. A family opened their rice pot and found the grains fused together by a thin, pale crust, soft, smooth, smelling faintly of tears. The mother began to scream. The father swallowed a mouthful before anyone could stop him. He hasn't spoken since. Children began drawing new things, not jars now, but faces without eyes, smiles that didn't reach mouths, and behind each figure always the same thing, a long, crooked shadow in the shape of a woman holding a clay jar that dripped. Dripped even on the paper, even on the walls, even when there was no ink. And then the bone-eyed dead appeared. Not to everyone, not all at once, just slowly, softly, like sorrow that finally found a voice. They stood at the foot of beds, in doorways, in the fields where rice once grew. Some came with broken necks, some with their jaws hanging loose like forgotten questions, some with baby arms cradled gently in theirs, arms made of mud and memory. All of them had the same eyes, empty sockets packed with white clay, and in the center, a single shard of bone sticking out like a pupil that had forgotten how to see. Mai saw the first of them in her reflection. She had gone to the river, not to bathe, not to pray, just to look. The water was dark now, thicker than it should be. She knelt beside it, leaned over, and there, beneath her own shadow, another face blinked up at her. It wore her sorrow, but not her skin. Its smile was slow. Its bone eyes glistened. And when it opened its mouth, she heard her own voice say, "I'm what's left when grief rots." She stumbled back. The river did not ripple. The mourning women began walking from house to house, trying to collect broken jars, but the jars refused to be found. Some had buried themselves deeper. Some had already crumbled. Some now sat atop hearths that no longer had fires, glowing faintly, as if heat came from inside the grief. One woman tried to smash hers with a hammer. The jar didn't break, but her wrist did. She said she heard a child laughing in the clay as her bones snapped. At the center of the village, a new tree had begun to grow. Not from seed, not from rain, from mourning. It grew overnight, its bark gray like cooled ash, its leaves shaped like tiny hands. Beneath it, villagers said they heard breathing. Some even claimed to see faces in the knots, faces they knew but from other people's memories. Mai stood beneath it one evening. She touched the bark. It was soft, warm, wet. She pulled her hand away and found her palm coated in milk-colored clay. Then she heard the whisper from nowhere and everywhere. Not all tears are yours, and not all ghosts want to leave. She returned home that night and found the hearth sealed again, smooth as if it had never broken. But she hadn't touched it. No one had. The stone was flawless. The air inside the room smelled of salt and rot. She knelt down and pressed her ear to the hearth. This time, she didn't hear breathing. She heard chewing. Slow, thoughtful, as if something beneath the floor was eating grief, one memory at a time. She whispered into the stone, "What are you?" The answer came not in words, but in sensation. Her back ached, her throat tightened, and she wept. But the tears didn't fall. They stayed in her eyes, hot and unmoving. And in her mind, an image flickered. A woman weeping into a jar that was already full, and something in that jar opening its mouth for more. The next day, a child was found kneeling in the river. She wasn't dead. She wasn't breathing either. When they lifted her, she opened her eyes and whispered, "The bone-eyed ones aren't angry. They're waiting." "For what?" someone asked. The girl smiled, "To be mourned properly." Then she closed her eyes again, and clay poured from her mouth like prayer. That night, every window in Haughton cracked. The jars, the ones still buried, began to hum, and from the earth came whispers, asking always the same thing: "Will you finish what we couldn't?"
By the 7th week, no one in Haughton trusted their own memories anymore. You would remember your father as a quiet man, and wake one morning to find a painting of him on your wall, weeping into a jar, surrounded by children you'd never seen. You'd swear your grandmother was buried near the old fig tree, only to find her name etched beneath the hearth of a house that hadn't existed when she died. Even the land shifted. Paths that once led to the rice fields now looped back toward the river. Doors you closed at night would open to rooms filled with muddy footprints and echoes of unfamiliar lullabies. Mai no longer entered her home at all. It wasn't hers anymore. The hearth had gone still, not silent, but expectant, as if whatever lived beneath was watching with closed eyes. Instead, she wandered the village with sleepless steps, searching for something she couldn't name. It wasn't her jar. It wasn't even answers. She was looking for a map, a way to trace sorrow back to its source. She found it in the oldest house in Haughton, the house of Elder Bing, who had died long before the river began to rise, and whose body had been buried beneath 7 layers of salt, per a ritual no one else remembered. The house was half swallowed by vines, its walls bowed with rain, its altar crumbled. But in the corner, beneath a sheet of woven grass, she found it, a hand-drawn map, etched in charcoal, faded but intact. It showed every home in the village, and beneath each one a symbol, a marking of the Mourning Jar's burial location, carefully labeled, circled, dated. Mai's breath caught. Her name wasn't on it, but her house was, and next to it was a mark she didn't recognize, a symbol not used for mourning. It meant something else, something forbidden. She brought the map to the surviving mourning women. Only one agreed to see her, the youngest, the one who had looked uneasy the night of Mai's first ritual. She unfolded the map on the floor between them. The woman's face went pale. "That symbol, we don't speak of that one." "Tell me," Mai whispered. The woman swallowed hard. "It means a jar reused, not by mistake, but on purpose, to bind one grief to another, a ritual of transfer." Mai stared at her. "But why would someone do that?" The woman looked away. "Because some grief is too heavy to carry alone." Mai returned to the map. There were others. 3 more houses marked with the same forbidden symbol. One had burned. One had been swallowed by the river. The last was still standing, a narrow, stilted home near the edge of the bamboo grove. It had belonged to a woman named Lan, who died during childbirth over 30 years ago. Her baby hadn't survived. Her husband had gone missing weeks later, presumed drowned. But no mourning ritual had ever been held. And yet, Her house bore the symbol. Mai stood at the edge of that abandoned home. The door was gone. The floor sagged inward, warped with rot. But beneath the hearth, barely visible, she saw it. A jar, half exposed, split down the side. And inside, a bundle of fabric, still intact, still dry, despite the wet earth. She knelt, pulled it gently into the light, unwrapped it. Inside was a lock of hair, not black, not brown, but gray, as if it had aged without a body. She buried it again, not with salt, not with tears, but with ashes, scooped from her own hearth, carried in trembling hands. And as she did, the ground pulsed, a slow, single breath. Not warning, thanks. That night, her dreams changed. She no longer stood in the river. She was in a room of stone, surrounded by hearths, each glowing faintly, each holding a jar, each humming with low, sorrowful sounds. And in the center of the room, a child sat cross-legged, watching her. She didn't smile, she didn't speak, but as Mai stepped closer, she realized her shadow stretched outward in every direction, connecting to every jar in the room. When Mai woke, the sun was already high. She hadn't slept that long in weeks. And beside her, placed gently on the reed mat, was a single stone from her hearth, still warm, still pulsing, and etched on the underside was a word in old script, yours. The villagers gathered that evening in silence, not by invitation, not by plan. They simply came, drawn by a heaviness in the air, a pull in their bones. Mai stood among them and held up the map. "We have mourned incorrectly," she said. "We have used sorrow like thread, tying one wound to another." The mourning woman stepped forward. "It can be undone," she said. "How?" someone asked. The woman looked at Mai. "By weeping for what was never yours, and then letting it go." They built fires across the village that night, not for warmth, for memory. Each household brought forward their broken jars, their remnants, their clay ghosts. Some crumbled as they touched air. Some hissed, releasing old voices that gasped, "Finally." One jar, too small to hold more than a few tears, exploded, and from its center, a voice whispered a lullaby no one recognized, but everyone felt. Mai returned to her hearth one last time. She knelt before it, laid the stone back in place, and whispered, "You may leave me now." She didn't know if the spirit was Lan, or the child, or the sorrow she herself had created, but something inside her lifted, not vanished, released. And when she stood, the footprint that had haunted her floor for weeks was gone.
The village believed Mai had wept for her husband, that she had honored him with tears, that she had fulfilled her duty beneath the weight of tradition. But grief, like truth, can be borrowed or faked. And in Haton, where mourning was measured in clay and silence, no one ever asked why the widow's tears were so steady, or who they were really for. Mai had played the role well. 7 nights, 7 tears, each one dropped carefully into the jar, each one offered with downcast eyes and folded hands. But behind her stillness was a truth she had buried far deeper than the mourning jar. She had never loved the man she wept for. Tuan had not been cruel, not exactly. He was dutiful, present, predictable. But he had loved her as a mirror, not a person. He wanted silence from her, not soul. He asked for obedience, not opinion. She had been a girl when they married, and grief was not something she understood then, only absence. Over the years, she became absence herself, a smile that never reached her eyes, a hand that stirred soup but felt nothing, a mouth that only opened when asked to speak. And when Tuan died, she did not feel heartbreak. She felt permission. But in Haton, emotion was not personal. It was ritual. And when a husband died, a wife must mourn, not because she missed him, but because he must be missed. It was a debt, and she paid it, not with sorrow, but with guilt. On the second night of her ritual, when the jar still smelled of earth and time, Mai had whispered, "I'm sorry, I'm not crying for you." And the jar had warmed. She should have stopped then. She should have confessed. But in that moment, she felt seen, not by the living, but by something underneath. Something that had heard false mourning before. Something that fed on it. The thing in the jar hadn't been Tuan. It had never been Tuan. And maybe it hadn't even been a ghost. Maybe it was something else entirely. A reflection of every sorrow never named, a shape formed by years of hollow rituals and silent women, pouring grief into clay like water into a cracked vessel. Again and again, never asking if the sorrow was truly theirs. Now, as the village burned its broken jars, Mai sat alone in the grove behind her home, hands clasped in her lap. The earth beneath her still pulsed faintly. Not angry, not restless, curious. And she spoke, finally, not to the villagers, not to the spirit, but to herself. "I wept for my mother, for the child I lost, for the dreams I buried to become a wife. But I never loved him." Her voice trembled. "And maybe I should have, not because I loved him, but because he never knew I didn't." In the distance, drums began to sound, low, slow. A new ritual begun by the mourning women to help guide the confused spirits to rest. But Mai stayed seated, because she knew her grief could not be guided. It had to be claimed. And so she dug. With bare hands, she clawed at the roots beside her, scooping dirt until her fingers bled. She unearthed her second jar, the one she had reburied after discovering it had been used. It was cold now, dry, but when she lifted it to her ear, it breathed. "I misused you. I offered false tears. I gave you sorrow that wasn't shaped for you." The wind stirred. A bird screamed once and fell silent. The jar pulsed, gently, then again. Mai took a breath. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the tiny cloth bundle she had carried for decades, the only relic of the child she had lost, a threadbare ribbon. She opened the jar. The air that spilled out was warm, stale, and familiar. And into it she dropped the ribbon, not as an offering, as a confession. She whispered, "These were the tears I never gave. Take them. Let them be yours now." Then she resealed the jar, not with salt, not with ash, but with her own blood, smeared across the rim, across her name, across her shame. And this time, she did not bury it. She carried it to the river, wading in past her knees, and she let it go. The jar sank slowly. The water hissed around it, then stilled, and beneath the surface she saw a shape rise up to meet it. Not a face, not a ghost, just a shadow, shaped like sorrow, stretching long and thin before dissolving into the current. When she turned to walk back to the shore, her legs felt heavier, but her chest lighter. And in that strange balance, something in her began to crack. Not break, open. That night, Mai returned home for the first time in days. The hearth was still sealed, the room was quiet, and on her floor, where the footprints once appeared, there was now only ash, neat, soft, as if the grief had burned itself out. She swept it gently into a bowl and placed it on her altar, with no incense, no prayers, just silence. And in that silence, for the first time, she mourned honestly.
Grief is meant to be a passage, a river you cross, a weight you carry, then set down. But in Hatan, grief had taken root. It no longer flowed, it grew, it changed shape, and now it had begun to feed. The river had stopped rising, but it hadn't receded. It hung at the edges of the village like a mouth that had forgotten how to close, wide, waiting, thick with heat. The waters were darker now, rippling with no wind and carrying strange things along its banks. Scraps of torn linen, bone-white petals, broken combs and old hairpins that hadn't been seen in generations. And sometimes, in the stillness, a name would drift up from the reeds, spoken softly, as if someone underwater was trying to remember. The villagers stopped walking near the river alone. Some stopped speaking altogether. They said words had become porous, that grief was now listening, and if you spoke too openly, something might answer. Mai had changed too, not visibly. Her back still curved from years of labor. Her fingers still trembled when cold came through the shutters. But inside, something had rearranged. She no longer dreamed in silence. She no longer wept with hesitation. What once felt like sorrow now moved like a second heartbeat. Not hers, not foreign, but fused. A grief no longer borrowed, claimed. She wandered the village most mornings, barefoot, as mist clung to the rooftops and crows gathered in odd circles. Some homes were still abandoned, others were half sunken. In one house, she found a widow burning clothes in the yard, not hers, not her husband's, but her sister's. "I found them folded beside my jar," the woman said quietly. "She died 5 years ago. She was buried far from here, but last night I heard her crying under my bed." Mai didn't ask what the woman did next. She only stood with her until the fire burned out. At noon that same day, a boy arrived at Mai's door. He held out a bundle of damp cloth. Inside, a wedding ring, her husband's, the one he had worn until the end, the one she had buried with him. He said he'd found it beside the river, resting in a pool of warm water that hadn't dried even in the sun. Mai took it, held it in her palm for a long time, and whispered, "You came back without asking." The ring glistened, not with metal, with clay,
That evening she returned to the mourning hut. It had become a shrine now, not by decree, but by need. The villagers had begun leaving their cracked jars inside. No offerings, no names, just the clay returned to silence. Mai placed the ring on a stone near the entrance. She didn't say a prayer. She didn't cry. But as she stepped back into the dusk, she felt a tug behind her ribs, a pull so deep it bent her breath. And in that ache, she heard a whisper. "You didn't mourn me, but I mourned you." She stumbled, fell to her knees, and wept. Not because of love, not even because of guilt, because in that moment she realized her husband had died lonely, not from illness, from distance, from a lifetime of silence between them, a gap that had never been named. And now, even in death, he had returned to fill it. The days blurred after that. Villagers whispered of odd phenomena. Frogs croaked lullabies. Mirrors fogged without heat. One child claimed to see a woman sitting in every hearth at night. Different faces, same posture, same broken jar in her lap. "She's waiting for someone to finish," the girl said. "Finish what?" "The weeping." Others began having dreams of becoming the dead, not seeing them, not speaking with them, being them. One man woke screaming, choking on invisible water, claiming he had been a woman giving birth on a floor of reeds, mourning her stillborn child with no one to hold her. Another dreamt of a soldier, teeth shattered, body broken, crawling home to a family that no longer lived where he left them. Each dream came with a new symptom: hair turning white, eyes rimmed with ash, hands stained faintly gray like clay dust that couldn't be washed away. The mourning women called it grief transference, but Mai knew better. This wasn't grief being passed along. This was grief becoming something else, a presence, a hunger, a sentience made from centuries of incomplete mourning, grief that had been buried but never soothed. And now it moved freely, shifting from jar to person, person to dream, dream to earth. No longer asking for permission, just looking for a place to finish. That night, Mai lit every candle in her home. She opened every door. She removed the stones from the hearth and sat cross-legged over the darkness. Then, softly, she said, "If I owe you tears, take them now." She felt nothing at first, just stillness, then warmth, then wait. Something sat across from her. She didn't see it. She felt it like a shape inside her own shape. And slowly, she began to cry. The tears came freely this time. They rolled down her cheeks, dripped from her chin, and struck the earth with soft, hollow thuds. And each one brought a memory, a moment she had swallowed, a word she had never spoken, a touch she had never felt again. The smell of her mother's hair humming while weaving mats, the smell of her child's hair before fever took him, the silence of Tuan's final breath, and the guilt of feeling nothing when it passed. She cried until her body shook, and when the last tear fell, she heard a whisper from the ground. "Now it fits." She resealed the hearth again, not with stone, with her hands, pressed clay into the cracks herself, smoothed the corners, and whispered, No more jars. In the morning, the river lowered, not by much, just enough for the water to stop touching the first doorstep, just enough for the fog to rise gently, as if exhaled, not spilled. And in the village square, 3 new jars sat in a circle, perfect, uncracked, empty, waiting. But no one touched them. Not anymore, because now they understood. Grief must be given, not stored, felt, not buried, and spoken, not sealed.
Some spirits have names. Some have stories. Some are remembered with incense and flowers. But the most dangerous ones are those who were never truly named, only buried. And in hot tone, the ground had kept their secrets for too long. Mai sat by the hearth, her hands pressed to the smooth clay she had laid with her own fingers. The room felt lighter, but not empty. It was the stillness of something held in place, acknowledged, honored. And yet, beneath that calm, she still felt the pull, a thread, leading backward towards something older, unfinished, unnamed. She returned to the map she had found in Elder Bin's home, ran her fingers over each circle, each marking, each place where grief had been buried and catalogued. Most were simple, a date, a name. But 5, only 5, were marked differently. A circle without text. No initials, no symbol, no prayer. Just space. As if the sorrow buried there had never belonged to anyone. She followed the first one. It led to a clearing just beyond the southern edge of the village, where bamboo grew crooked and wind never passed. There, beneath a fallen shrine stone, she found the remnants of a hearth, crumbled, blackened, cold. She knelt and touched the soil. It caved in easily, like something beneath had hollowed it out from the inside. And when she dug deeper, with fingers, not tools, she found it. A mourning jar, unsealed, but not empty. Inside was ash, pale, fine, disturbed. And nestled in the ash, wrapped in a decayed length of red thread, was a tongue, shriveled, hardened, preserved in silence. She reburied it, carefully, and she whispered, "I'm listening now." No wind answered, but she left the space with her head bowed, because some griefs cannot be named, only witnessed. The next sight took her to the river bend, where the water carved out a natural pool hidden behind brush and vine. She stepped barefoot into the silt. It stuck to her ankles like hands. And when she reached the center, she felt it underfoot. Not rock, not wood, but clay. She knelt and pulled the jar loose. This one was cracked, stained red, and still weeping. Water poured from its seams, though none entered from outside. Inside the jar was a comb, simple, wooden, missing 2 teeth, and carved faintly along its spine. Not his, not mine, not wanted. It wasn't grief that haunted this jar. It was shame, a sorrow denied, pressed into silence so long that it had begun to echo. Back in the village, others had begun to notice the places where names were missing. One house had no ancestral altar. Another had no grave markers in its yard. A third had a sealed mourning jar placed outside, not buried, as if even the sorrow inside had been unwelcomed in the earth. They brought these to Mai, not to fix, but to confess. I didn't want to mourn him, so I didn't. I lied. She wasn't my real daughter, but I was told to cry anyway. He beat me. I gave him no tears, only mud. And slowly the picture became clear. There were not just spirits rising from the broken jars. There were fragments, pieces of sorrow that didn't belong to anyone anymore. Tears shed for duty, grief faked for safety, mourning performed without meaning. All of it had seeped into the village like a slow flood, until the dead no longer knew who they were, because their names were whispered without truth. Mai knew what she had to do. She returned to the grove, built a small circle of stones, one for every nameless jar she had found, and in the center she placed her own, cracked now, dry, but still warm. She sat there for hours, not praying, not crying, just remembering. Her mother, her child, Tuan, Lan, the unnamed woman under the tree, the girl who borrowed her tears, and every other forgotten sorrow that had passed through her hands without permission. And then softly, she whispered the words no one had ever said. I don't know who you are, but I know you were here, and I know you were hurt, and I know you were not mourned. I will mourn you now. Her tears didn't fall. They rose from the earth beneath her, from the soil, from the stones, from the cracks in her voice, and the air thickened with something holy. Not forgiveness, not closure, just recognition. The next morning, villagers found that the jars placed outside had vanished. No footprints, no fire, no sign of theft, just absence, gentle and clean. And on each door, someone had drawn a single mark in gray chalk, a spiral looping inward, a symbol from the old tongue once used only at the end of rituals. It meant, carried no longer. And from that day forward, no one in Ha Tan ever buried mourning jars again. They did not seal grief in clay. They spoke it aloud. They walked it to the river. They sang it to the fields. They whispered it to the trees. And when they cried, they let their tears fall wherever they needed to, because sorrow was no longer something to contain. It was something to release, even and especially for those who had died without a name.
Some in the village still believed that what haunted Ha Ton was vengeance, that the spirits had returned to punish the living, to claim payment for borrowed grief, to drag liars into the river and curse every hearth that dared bury a false jar. But those who listened closely, those who truly listened, knew otherwise. The dead weren't seeking revenge. They were seeking completion, and justice had nothing to do with it. One night, a girl named Suong dreamt she was standing in a field of open mouths, each one filled with teeth made of clay, each one whispering the same sentence. It wasn't fair, but we're not angry. She woke with her hands cupped around her chest, as if holding something fragile. There was nothing there, but her palms smelled like salt. Another man, Old Dot came to Mai's door at dawn. His hands were shaking. His shirt was soaked in sweat. "I saw her," he said. "My mother, the night before she died." Mai nodded. "In a dream?" "No," he said. "In the window." He told her he had never mourned her properly, that when she passed, he was too busy harvesting rice, and his cousin wept in his place. "I let him cry into the jar. I signed the scroll. We sealed it anyway." And for years, he heard nothing. Until now. "She came back," he whispered, "just to ask me." His voice broke. "If I ever loved her." Mai said nothing. She simply took his hand and pressed it to the clay on her hearth. It was warm again, but not pulsing, not threatening, just waiting. That night, the villagers gathered around the old banyan tree at the edge of the temple ruins. No one had planned it. They just came, carrying jars, relics, names. Mai stood in the center. She didn't lead them. She only held space. One by one, the villagers stepped forward to speak. Not stories, not confessions, just truths. "I wasn't ready when you died. I pretended to cry, but I was relieved. I missed you so much I forgot how to breathe. I hated you for leaving. I didn't know what to feel. I felt nothing." And still the spirits did not rise in fury. There were no screams, no broken mirrors, no floods. Only wind and the faintest scent of clay dust in the air. Later that evening, Mai sat alone beside her sealed hearth. She ran her hands over the surface, tracing the lines she had carved after reburying her grief. And she spoke quietly. "You're not waiting for justice, are you? You're waiting for someone to say you mattered." In her dreams that night, the spirits gathered, not as monsters, not even as ghosts, as shapes of sorrow, translucent, quiet, folded in on themselves like memories softened by time. Each held a jar, some broken, some full, some empty. None of them asked for apologies. They only watched her, and one by one they began to fade. But not all. One lingered. The girl, small, barefoot, holding the same chipped jar from weeks ago. She stepped forward, held it out. Mai hesitated. "Why won't you leave?" The girl tilted her head. "Because I don't want justice. I want belonging." Mai understood. She reached into the jar and found something smooth inside, not ash, not water. A pebble, no larger than a tooth. She held it in her hand. It was warm. And when she looked up, the girl was gone. In the morning, the pebble remained. She placed it on her altar, lit no incense, said no prayer. But all day, the air in her home smelled of jasmine. And for the first time in weeks, her shadow no longer stretched behind her as if it followed someone else's sorrow. It moved with her, whole. From that day forward, no one in Haton spoke of hauntings. Not because they forgot, because they finally understood. What had come for them was not punishment. It was the residue of unspoken love left too long in the dark. And now, in the light, it no longer needed to take form. It only needed to be felt. The villagers still mourned, but not in jars, not in silence. They wept together now, spoke names without fear, held grief like a thread, not a chain. And when the wind passed through their fields, it no longer whispered through broken clay. It sang, low, gentle, whole.
In Ha-tone, the number 7 was sacred. 7 tears, 7 nights, 7 days before sealing the mourning jar. But no one had ever wept twice for the same spirit. No one had dared. Until Mai. Her hearth was whole again. Not untouched, the cracks still ran beneath the surface like old scars, but sealed, firm, patient. And yet the air around it hummed faintly, as if someone still lingered just below, not angry, not bound, just unfinished. The ritual had been performed once, but not properly. The tears she gave were borrowed. The grief she offered, misdirected. And now, something beneath the clay still waited, not for exorcism, not for fire, but for truth. Mai went to the mourning woman's hut the next morning. Only one remained, the youngest, who had stayed while the others had left, were fallen silent. The woman saw Mai enter and said only, "You're going to do it again." Mai nodded. "This time, I'll mean it." Together, they prepared the space. Not in secret, not in ceremony, in humility. They chose a new jar, freshly shaped, unfired, still warm from the sun. Mai held it in her lap and whispered, "Not for my husband, not for myself, but for the one I never mourned because I never knew how." The woman said nothing. She only lit a strand of hair, the ancient substitute for incense when words were too heavy. The flame flickered once, then bent inward. And so began the second mourning. 7 nights again, but this time not by obligation, by invitation. Night 1. Mai sat alone in the center of her room. No fire, no chant, only the jar, warm in her hands. She thought of the girl, the one with the jar that had wept too long. She thought of the sorrow she'd unknowingly shared, of the borrowed tears, of the grief that had shaped itself inside her without name or permission. And for the first time, she cried for the stranger. A full tear, heavy. It hit the bottom of the jar like a drumbeat in a hollow body. Night 2. She dreamt of Lan, the woman who had died in childbirth, her sorrow reused by another mourner in secret. Mai stood beside her in the dream, but Lan did not look at her. She held her child, still, gray, clay-faced. "You borrowed a grave that didn't belong to you," Lan said without turning. Mai knelt in the dream. "Then let me give you mine." She woke weeping and dropped the second tear into the jar. Night 3. The river whispered again, but this time it didn't call names. It sang, soft, low, the melody of breath exhaled through reeds. She walked to the bank before dawn, held the jar to the fog, and said, "If there are spirits who drowned before tears were shed, I carry them tonight." A tear rolled down her cheek, unprovoked, unclaimed, and she caught it in the jar. 3. Night 4. A child knocked on her door at midnight. No one was outside, but on the ground, a tiny handprint in pale clay. She left the door open as she wept,
and whispered, "You don't have to knock anymore." Night 5. Her shadow split in two. She stood beside herself in a dream, one version older, heavier, weary with years of ritual. The other, small, wiry, wearing her mother's apron, crying behind a water jar too tall to lift. The smaller Mai turned and said, "You never cried for me." And the older Mai replied, "I'm crying now." She woke with her fist clenched. Inside, a pebble, round, smooth, still warm. She dropped it into the jar. It didn't splash, it sank. Night 6. A silence came over the village. No frogs, no wind, even the river hushed, as if all of Haton had paused to listen. Mai didn't cry. She simply sat, breathing, eyes closed, and still a tear escaped, not from sorrow, from relief. Night 7. She held the jar close to her chest. The room was still. She didn't think of Tuan, not of her child, not of Lan, not of the girl. She thought of all the unknown griefs, the unspoken, the misnamed, the shamed, the ones whispered behind closed doors, rushed through rituals, or swallowed because tradition made no space for complicated mourning. And she said aloud, "I see you." Then 7 tears fell, all at once, and the jar grew hot in her hands, not burning, alive. She sealed it gently, not with ash, not with salt, with rice dust and breath, the old method, forgotten by most, remembered only by the earth. Then she buried it, not beneath her hearth, but beneath her bed. Because this grief no longer needed to stay out of sight. It needed to sleep with her, to be accepted, integrated, held. That night, she dreamt of nothing and woke up rested for the first time in months, maybe years. The next morning, the fog over Haton had lifted, not gone, but thinned, enough for the sun to touch the edge of the river, and in that light, the water shimmered, not thick, not red, clear, not pure, but honest.
They say water remembers. It holds the shape of what it touches. It cradles the echo of every grief it swallowed. And when it rises, it doesn't only bring destruction, it brings memory. On the 13th day since Mai's second mourning ended, the hearth cracked again. Not violently, not with fire or voices, but with a soft, wet sound, the sigh of earth surrendering to water. Mai had risen early. She was grinding rice by hand, preparing to visit the girls' old house one last time. But the moment the stone split, she dropped the bowl. Because it wasn't just her hearth. All across Hatun, the hearths had begun to break open, gently, deliberately, like mouths opening to speak. The villagers gathered outside, stunned, silent. No one screamed, no one ran. They stood barefoot on soft, damp earth as steam rose from beneath the floors. Not smoke, not mist, but a kind of breath, warm, clay-scented, alive. From within the hearths came no ghosts, no wailing, only tears, literal water leaking upward, years of sealed grief, now unsealed, and the village wept. At Mai's home, the clay she had pressed into the cracks weeks ago had dissolved, revealing a pool beneath her hearth. Not deep, but warm, still. And in its center floated her second jar, the one she had buried under her bed, now risen. Not broken, not glowing, just open, waiting. She knelt beside it, reached in, touched the water. It rippled outward once, twice, then stilled. And from beneath the surface, a figure began to take shape. Not flesh, not bone, not ghost. Grief personified, soft and wet and hollow-eyed. The girl, not as before, not weeping or clay-skinned, but calm, at peace. She sat cross-legged inside the hearth, as if the jar had become a room and her body the vessel. She looked up at Mai and smiled. No words passed between them. They didn't need to, because something old had been fulfilled. Not forgiven, not forgotten, finished. Outside, the river surged, but it did not flood. It rose just enough to reach the roots of every house, then stopped. The current slowed, thickened, turned gold in the light of the low sun, and then slowly it began to recede, taking with it every unsealed jar that had remained buried. They floated like small boats, spinning gently, as if being carried home. The villagers watched. No one chased them. No one claimed theirs, because they understood now. What was inside had already been heard. As night fell, Mai stood in her doorway, hands resting on the frame, watching the moon rise clean and full. Her home smelled of damp ash and jasmine. The steam had faded. The hearth was now a shallow basin, no longer sealed, no longer hidden, just part of the floor, part of the house, part of her. She stepped over it without fear, because grief was no longer beneath her, it was with her. In the distance, laughter echoed, small, real human laughter. Children playing near the water. One of them called out, "It's warm again!" Another shouted, "There's a fish shaped like a jar!" Mai smiled. She didn't correct them, because maybe it was. Maybe sorrow had taken new shape. Maybe it had been carried downriver to become something gentler, something that didn't ask to be held anymore. Before bed, Mai lit a single candle. She placed it beside the hearth, not as an offering, but as a light for anyone still returning. Then she sat beside it, knees tucked to her chest, and spoke out loud just once. "If you come again, you'll find me ready, not afraid, not silent. I will cry with you, and when you are finished, I will let you go." The flame flickered. The air shifted, but nothing appeared, and that was enough. Years passed. The river changed course, just slightly, enough to swallow one path, to uncover another, enough to remind the villagers that nothing in Haton ever stayed still. The jars were gone. Some believed they had all been carried to the sea. Others whispered they had returned to the clay fields, the very earth that birthed them, dissolving back into silence. But no one tried to find them, because in Haton they had finally stopped asking where grief goes, and started learning how to live beside it. Most homes no longer had hearths, not the old kind. The new ones were low,
round, open to the air. Places for warmth, yes, but also for conversation, for memory, for weeping when needed. Children grew up hearing stories not just of ancestors, but of the ones never named. They were told that sorrow could take many forms: a cracked voice, a heavy shadow, a river that wouldn't dry, a jar placed too early, a song sung with someone else's grief. And they were taught that all of it was welcome. All of it could be held. For a while. Mai grew older. Her back curved deeper. Her hair turned soft and silver. But her eyes held a calm that had once been unknown to Haton. The calm of someone who had faced the shape of her sorrow and survived it. She no longer lived in fear of the dead. Sometimes she still felt them, like mist at her ankles when the rain returned, or a chill across her neck when she passed the old fig tree. But she no longer mistook it for haunting. It was remembrance, a shared breath, a passing shadow that didn't want to stay, only to be acknowledged. One spring morning, a traveler arrived in Haton. Young, curious, foreign. He carried a camera, asked questions. Is it true the village used to trap grief in jars? Did people really cry into clay? Are the spirits still here? Most villagers smiled, but said little. Only Mai answered. She led him to the river bend. It looked ordinary now. Just water, reeds, a few dragonflies skimming the surface. But Mai knelt at the edge and pointed. There, buried in silt and moss, was a shard of clay, no larger than her thumb. She held it up, showed him the smooth side, and there, still visible, was a faint trace of etching, a single teardrop. She didn't offer a legend. She didn't explain the ritual. She only said, this belonged to someone who tried to carry too much. The traveler asked what happened to them. Mai smiled softly. They were heard. He asked if he could take the shard. Mai shook her head. No, but you can leave something. He hesitated, then pulled a small slip of paper from his pocket, wrote one word, a name, and buried it in the riverbank. Mai nodded, and the wind moved, just enough to part the reeds, just enough to make space. That night, Mai sat by her hearth, still lit, still warm. She took a final jar from her shelf. It was blank, unused. She placed it gently into the coals, watched as the clay darkened, cracked, and finally collapsed in on itself. She let it burn to ash, and when only fragments remained, she swept them into the earth beneath her feet. Not with sorrow, but with peace, because she knew now where the tears go. They do not vanish, they do not curse, they do not come back as ghosts. They soften the ground, they feed the roots, they make room for something new. In the quiet that followed, Mai closed her eyes, not in fear, not in longing, but in rest. And outside the river flowed on, still carrying names, still whispering sorrow, but never again trapped in clay.